Okay.
All right, it's 6:30 on July 6th, and call the Finance Administration Council Committee to order. Any changes or modifications to the agenda? If there are none, we will take the agenda as approved. Seeing none, the agenda is approved. Let's see if there are no members of the public present in the council chambers. Look to see if there are any online. I will attempt to see if there are any online, if I know how to do that.
There are none.
Nobody online. Okay, thanks. There are no members of the public online, so no members of the public for public comment. Moving on to approval of the minutes from the June 21st, 2022 F&A committee meeting. Any modifications, additions to the draft minutes? No. If there are no objections, we'll take the minutes as approved as is. Seeing no objections, the minutes are so approved. Approval of the claims report dated July 6, 2022. Any questions or comments from committee members? No. I'll report to the committee. I have received no emails from any any council member asking questions about anything on the claims report. So if there are no objections, we'll take the claims report as approved for forwarding to the full council on the consent agenda. Seeing no objection, claims report is so approved. Agenda Bill 22-074, Financial Management Policy. Are we having a discussion tonight, or what is this? What are we doing with this item tonight?
Good evening. On the agenda, our proposed action tonight is discussion only.
Okay. Is there any discussion from staff, or is it just for council discussion?
It's for council discussion. We're happy to answer questions. We're happy to go through presentation, whatever you'd like.
All right. And just so that I can catch up on this, sorry, since I was gone, I know the idea was to move through at some point to take this to council. Am I correct that we have not yet done that? Taken it to full council, or we have, or?
For their approval, no.
Or for
their awareness, there was discussion, but not for action.
A copy of the updated proposed policies and whatnot were sent to them for their review. It has not been discussed at council yet. And then I believe it's coming up on the agenda, correct?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so hold on. So we'll get to that later. So I'm just trying to catch up where we are now. Okay, so the idea here was it was a chance for us to have any discussion before it would then go forward to the council. Councilmember Holloway.
Well, so there was an ask of what are we doing today? What's the financial policy you're proposing, and how's it affect tomorrow? Where is that material?
Well, the material was on vacation last week, but we do have a high-level overview. It's a crosswalk, so it was a document added to the F&A committee agenda to help with what is proposed change. We also, though, had the ask of the committee. This was an added Exhibit 3 in the agenda bill.
This was in the materials that went out to us?
Yeah, it was.
Correct.
Oh, I missed it.
Following the other,
Or at least it's on the agenda.
the previously circulated documents.
Oh, I didn't see it.
We
Okay.
also had time to prepare a presentation that identifies the changes for the reserve targets in that section. And so that is something that we were able to put together for tonight's discussion.
All right, do you want to go through that?
Certainly. I'm going to have Drew, I don't know if we have this available for online, if I can share my screen.
And the chart, I think, was on page 143.
Scroll
No,
way
seriously,
down.
All right, I
Page
admit I didn't go to
143 to
page
6.
143.
Way down.
You guys have scribbles, but they went through and they compared the financial policies from before with what the proposed is, and then they kind of line item it.
And there's a actual work plan at the end of the
All right,
package.
so I'll have to study that. I'm never going to absorb that in 5 minutes. Thanks, though.
I've heard amazing things about you, so I'm shocked.
I had to get online.
Where did you go? Where did you go? Where did you go?
Oh, dear.
Yeah, we'll start with this. All right.
Share screen again. Share screen and then there it is. Yeah.
All right. All right, so this is a short presentation slide deck of reserve policy discussion. So currently, in the general fund, the reserve policy is set at 16.5%. And what we've depicted here is the amounts that are over. This here depicts where we need to have reserves set aside to meet that current target. These are the amounts that we are currently over our current target. So what this means is that when we look at it just from a numbers perspective, here's what we're required to have at the end of each of the years in this 10-year outlook. And this is the amount that we have over that target, the 16.5%. And you can see in 2025, we start to eat into the overage.
I was just gonna say, can you make sure you're speaking to the microphone?
Sorry about that.
Is it on?
I believe so.
Okay.
It's just hard to hear you.
It's a little hard to hear.
All right. So again, this is an example of from a numbers perspective, our current policy for reserves in the general fund is 16.5%. And this includes a cash flow reserve of 10%, an operating reserve of 5%, and a contingency reserve of 1.5%. So in total, throughout this 10-year outlook, we show that we have sufficient reserves. However, let go of this mouse here. It's a new mouse. Sorry about that. So nonetheless, you can see in 2025, in our forecast right now, we start to reduce the amount of our overage. And in 2030, this would be the year where we would continue to have our fund balance that's required, but we would be starting to eat into that set aside.
So, sorry, can I just ask, because this is a whole different conversation, and this would absolutely violate the policies that we have right now, which is that general fund expenditures not exceed general fund revenues. And this is sort of a path to bankruptcy for the city. To use up $500,000 to $1 million, to run a deficit of $500,000 to $1 million, that's a pretty big proposal to make there. I think what I've always understood is that to the extent we had more reserves than we needed, that we would transfer that to capital funds and use that for one-time projects, but that we would not run a situation, the current policy is we would not run a situation where current general fund expenditures exceed current general fund revenues, because that's not a sustainable model. So this is suggesting a different concept.
Well, that's a typical, in a forecast, this is what is identifying or daylighting the imbalance or the fact that we have to make some changes, whether we improve on our revenues over time, or we shift and develop a new reserve target. So nonetheless, it is policy for the council to decide. And in the proposed new policy, that same policy statement is that if we ever go below the targets, then the council needs to decide how they're going to fix it. And so this is that snapshot of what we're seeing right now for 10 years. So yes, we would want to fix it so that we are not in this negative situation.
Right, but what this is showing is in 2022, this is saying we have 600,000 excess fund balance. So, it's 3.5 million excess. Is that what it's saying?
That's correct.
So that 3.5 million is not allowed under current policy to be used to fund general fund. That has to be used to fund one-time costs. The general fund expenditures have to fit within general fund revenues. That's the current policy and has been for the entire time I've been on the council. That's been the policy of the council for general funds. So when I first looked at this, I thought, okay, 3.5 million that would transfer to capital funds, which great news. We have a need for more money over in capital funds for one-time projects, a pool. So that's what I would have thought would happen there. But this is proposing that we run deficits for the next however many years and just fund them with fund balance, that's a whole different notion of what should the fund balance be and what should we do with the notion that we should use the excess in this manner is not consistent with current policy.
Well, then that's a decision and a conversation that the council has to have during the biennial budget development process. That would be a major policy question, is what to do with this excess.
Okay, but for what it's worth, that is the current policy.
Yes, it
okay.
is. Yes.
Okay.
So the 2.5 million that's right now proposed to shift over to the CIP is not coming out of this, but is coming out of ending fund balance?
Well, this is ending fund balance.
Okay.
Yeah.
So you're showing us different ways we could use it. 2.5 could go to capital funds, or it could be used this way. There's sort of different options, is what you're trying to point out?
Well, this, if you look at this forecast here, because you don't see the breakout of ending fund balance. So at the bottom here, you see that our ending fund balance at the end of 2022 is identified as $6.4 million.
Me too.
I know, it's so small. You need big sheets. I absolutely understand. Whoops.
Well, that's not fair.
Yeah, Because the,
Well, they're not going to show the operating transfer to the CIP because that took place after
after this,
we built the financial forecast. Yeah.
okay.
So this is based on the financial forecast from the retreat that we provided to council, which is why you see the lines crossing at roughly 2025. Hence the reason why our fund balance is going to decline starting at that point.
Okay, so if I'm, hopefully I'm speaking loud enough that some microphones are picking me up. Hopefully, so if I'm understanding this, this is saying actually we'll run at a surplus for the next biennium,
Yes.
but
Right.
then, you know,
Then
Part
they
of the-
cross.
Part of the conversation, the
Right.
lines cross at 2025.
2025.
Part of the
Yeah.
conversation is the ARPA transfer in that you see row, right? For example, under revenues.
oh, yes.
Right here, so that's always been generally a point of conversation as well.
And is the spending of the ARPA somewhere down here?
Yeah, so in essence it is, yes.
Okay,
It
so that's,
would be used to
so
support
that's
our-
offset with some stuff down here.
Right, it would be used to support our kind of operating needs over time. right?
Okay.
Help draw out, basically before our expenditures start to exceed our revenues.
Okay.
So it elongates that.
So this sort of helps cover that COVID, if I could just call it that, the COVID shortfall, if you will. This kind of helps with that.
Revenue losses that we had, we can then use that to support public safety needs and stuff like that over time, so.
Okay, so that's sort of what drives that, is we got some help, some external help. But then the line crosses, we got a problem. This model, or sorry, the other page said, well, if you use that model up by using your excess reserves, it could look like that. Or we could figure out other ways to solve this, right?
Well, so we're gonna have to have some conversation around strategies about making sure that our current revenues exceed our current expenditures, and we can push that out farther.
Got it.
Right, and so that's gonna be a conversation kind of moving forward here through this budget process. is
Got it.
What does that picture ultimately look like for us? You talked about a policy, right, with council. That, in my opinion, hasn't necessarily been codified, right, within our policies itself.
This is a good point. This is one of the whole discussions around our policies. Is there's many policies that we're operating under,
Right.
but you actually go look for them. Like, where was that codified? And it's unclear, and maybe we can track it down, or maybe we can't, but why the heck wouldn't we put it into our policies, right?
One of the typical conversations during budget development, when council adopts a budget and they establish policy, it happens for 1 year or 2 years, and then if it's not codified, if it's not put into long-term policy, then it's sunset at the end of
What-
that budget year.
Okay, so that's your opinion. I will tell you that council members will not share that opinion. We've been following some of these policies for almost 2 decades.
That was not council intent, but that may have been what happened as we go through the financial directors.
Yeah. For example, we have a whole debt that we paid off there was a specific funding source that was identified to pay that debt. You won't find that codified in the policy, but that is absolutely, for the entire term of that debt, how we actually operated it. And I only came on to council at the tail end of that, but I was aware of that, so. Okay, let me, there's one other thing I wanted to ask. What was it? I don't know, did you have questions?
No, it's just, you forgive me, I put, ending, the reserves are a component of the ending fund balance. They're not the total ending fund balance, and what you were showing was we're gonna draw down the ending fund balances, but the reserves may be fund at the 16.5%, whatever.
That's correct.
Yeah.
So the current policy for reserves, we have an issue when we get out into 2030, 2031. Or excess, anything excess over the reserve charges.
Not sure I agree with that. Could we go back to the slide before this?
Well, you would expect to go back. Yeah, with inflation what it is and us limited to the 1%. Given all the changes, eventually those lines are forced. 2030, I could believe.
I think you got about 6 months before those lines cross.
Oh, okay.
I think you get about 6
Right.
months, yeah. We're facing 8% inflation. You got a 1% property tax cap. We are in crisis. It's going to hurt a lot. All right, so my question was, so am I right if I wanted to sort of say, well, where do we think we'll be? Look, let me pick 21. So if I take these two numbers together, that's our ending general fund balance. Is that correct?
I'm going to jump ahead to
Okay.
show, to show that at the end there, the ending fund balance of 5.5, 82 in
Got it here.
2021.
Yep.
Right? So that breakout then is this table for,
Okay, that's great.
okay?
Could you go back to that slide then, the 5? Oops. Yeah, that guy.
Okay.
So if I just look at that guy, here's my question. Which fund balances are in there? Which funds?
The general fund.
Yes, there's a whole bunch of funds inside the general fund.
Rental operating, so.
Fund
the general
numbers.
Fund, the reserves, so 002, 003, 004. The managerial funds that we have, that includes the North and Police Services Fund, for example. And then there are a number of, I would say, smaller special revenue funds, including community development. The community development fund is not a small fund.
That's the one I'm really asking about, is community development.
Well, it should be, yeah.
So community development fund balance is in there?
Yes.
Okay,
And you-
cool.
You should be able to see CD here, and the developer reimbursement expenditures, which is where the community development. fund.
Got it, okay. So this is, and what, you didn't say Fund 1, doesn't that have
Well,
a few
It does
million?
include the general fund as well.
Yeah, okay, so this is all of our general fund balances.
Our finances is kind of 4 buckets.
Yeah.
General governmental.
Yep.
Kind of governmental capital, utilities, and then the internal services. This is focused on that kind of one first primary bucket overall for the city that pays for most of our operating expenses.
Got it, okay.
Fire.
So I just want to make sure everything's sort of in, but that's all in. Okay, super. Questions?
Nope, I'm just following along.
Okay. All right, super, thank you. So I think I threw you off your presentation. If you want to go back where you were and then sort of proceed from there, that's
Just
fine.
All right. So this chart, it depicts the table then, the breakout.
I'm just
Yeah,
gonna stay up here.
stand up. Great. So this depicts the table. So, and this is current policy with those 3 components in the reserve, the current reserve, 16.5. If we shift to the proposed financial management policy, we shifted to a proposed range from 15% to 20% to give the council flexibility in managing overall general governmental reserves. So what this shows is that range where you can see, and I'm going to jump to this table. So compared to the current, we provided the same data. So at the minimum of 15% in the target, you see at the 2030, 2031, where we essentially kind of dig into that excess. At the maximum, obviously, we dig in sooner. So this doesn't have these two they're 2 separate charts. Which one do you want to go back to?
This one. These 2 years are inflated by ARPA, correct?
Right,
Yes.
so you go back to the financial forecast, you'll see an ARPA transfer for 2022, 2023, and 2024.
So 10,000-foot view, ARP is keeping us from the crossover point.
Correct, that crossover point would probably happen a lot sooner in 2023, basically.
Mayhew thinks 6 months.
Right, so in essence, right, that crossover point would be a lot sooner without those ARPA funds.
It's moving it out to 2025.
Yeah,
It's my thinking is those ARPA fund, I almost like to keep those segregated from this kind of conversation so that we don't just throw that into the ending fund balance and it gets washed out. And we do targeted things with that ARPA money beyond just put it in the ending fund balance.
I think that makes sense.
So, Councilmember
how do we use it to generate more revenue, whatever, or how do we get it to reduce expenses?
So, Councilmember Holloway, building on that, because I think I agree with you. I definitely agree with the concept, but yeah, one for you. But I think there's sort of a bigger thought there, and I'd love to, well, all of us maybe have a conversation about it. So I just want to sort of launch a concept at you and see what you think of this. So two big thoughts. Three big thoughts. The first is one of the concerns I've had. So I think Snoqualmie's, certainly the entire time I've been on the council, has been very financially prudent, in my opinion, regarding reserves. We've had fully funded reserves. In fact, as you're pointing out here, more than fully funded reserves, shall we say. I'm a little frustrated in that part of the reason that's happened is that we have sort of systematically, that sounds like it's intentional, I don't mean intentional, we have managed to overestimate our expenses every year in the budgeting cycle, and therefore we end up ending the year in the black, if you will. And to me, that's missed opportunity to spend those funds on services in the city. And so I'm very supportive and encouraging of us not continuing to do that. I don't, sort of squirreling away money, if you will, in essence, unintentionally, to where we have more reserves than we needed. I don't think that's a good practice. Let's spend that money on services. That's revenue we're collecting. So that's just number one. Number two is, with respect to the reserves, the council has never articulated any guidance on how we would use those reserves. Okay, so we have them. We say they're for a purpose. I think each one of them has a name, like rainy day or something like that.
Cash flow and operating.
Yep. But we never say what would constitute a condition under which we would draw on them. We've never defined that. And so as of, say, 3 years ago, I thought this is something we should fix. But then I watched that play out in COVID, because guess how many dollars of our reserves we pulled on during the COVID downturn, which is exactly a time you would think we would use those reserves. Not a penny. And you might say, well, we had this ARPA funds. Fair enough, we did. But let me tell you what we actually did. We did hiring freezes. We did spending cutbacks. We reduced services. I'm not saying that those weren't necessary, but what I'm saying is, if we did that and didn't draw on our reserves, I wonder, actually, I'll just say, I believe we cut back farther than we needed to.
Some of that was extraneous stuff.
Yep, I understand. I'm not trying to sort of point fingers. I'm just trying to make an observation. And it leads me to this. And by the way, just as a side point, you can watch our state legislature do the same thing with reserves. In good years, they fund these reserves. They really don't describe how they'll get used. And guess what they do in short years? They raid them. This is the term. You just look up raid state reserves, and it's on the Seattle Times. There's an article, So they have the same problem there. But with that in mind, let me sort of throw this out for thought, because I feel very strongly about not having general fund expenditures exceed general fund revenues as a general rule. I mean, in any 1 year, you can wiggle a little bit, fine. But let me suggest this. I think the state even has this. I'm not positive about that, but many governmental organizations have they call it something like a stabilization reserve, or some terminology like that. And the concept is, when you have a period of a shock, right, which is exactly what we have right now. We're having a shock to the system, which is why we suddenly popped up to 8% inflation. I mean, God, let's hope it's a shock and it goes back down, right? But if that's the case, which is what most economists believe, is that this is a shock. We've got some contributing factors: a war in Ukraine, gas prices, supply chain problems. We got some weird behavior from consumers because they're flush with stimulus money. That's going to work. So it's a shock to the system. So the idea behind a stabilization fund is actually you'll use that fund to fund a shortfall, intentionally have a temporary shortfall in revenues versus expenditures with an intent that that'll end in a certain amount of time. But that way you don't, as a city, react by cutting services when there's just a temporary shock to the system. You've set some money aside to get you through that, if you will. So none of the reserves that we have here are discussed as working that way. But my thought is maybe we should give some thought to something like that. So if we, so I'm simultaneously sort of saying two things tonight. One is, I think we're 6 months away from crisis. And number two, I think there's some resources here that maybe we should think about using to address that and viewing that as something that gets us through a time period. So maybe that's something to think about. So that was a lot of talking. So Councilmember Holloway, I was trying to build on your point.
At the beginning, when we started research, you have to remember the city got flooded about once a year. So there was intention that part of those reserves were there for emergency conditions.
Yep.
Consider 8% inflation and post-pandemic echo as a disaster happening that we could dip into the reserve, and those reserves to help out.
We had the water main problem just 2 years ago. It cost us $1 million. Now, granted, that's in the utility fund, but still that kind of concept. Same thing you're talking about, right? So I think, to me, when I look at some of these numbers, 16%, 10%, 5%, I have always been, the whole time I've been on council, very critical of that kind of approach. I think, look, and then you say, well, let's compare ourselves to other cities. Well, you can't compare Snoqualmie to Issaquah. The revenue streams look vastly different. The percentage of revenue we get from property tax is much higher, right? So the nice thing about sales tax is when prices go up, sales taxes go up. It naturally adjusts. Property tax doesn't work that way, not in Washington anyway, other states, but not Washington. So we probably are at kind of almost the extreme end of cities in Washington really getting hurt in inflation because so much of our revenue such a large percentage comes from property tax. So using like a 16%, 10%, 5%, any of those kind of numbers, I think just isn't, I think it's a very use better words. It's a very blunt way of kind of doing this. Now, what I propose is something that's more complex. So great, where's all our staff that's going to do this complex thing? But my concept is, wouldn't it be nice if we could kind of think about what kind of amounts of emergencies have we had? And Councilmember Holloway, you were making a great point. We know what we spent in those flood years. We know what we spent 2 years ago. So, and we can sort of apply some, bad word, inflation rates, right, to that. And we can kind of come up with, we probably need, the kind of disaster we would have that would be a disaster might be $2 million, might be kind of the max we have to worry about. So we can kind of look at that from historical and then maybe do some adjustments. Maybe we put in a buffer factor. Maybe we put it 50% higher just to be safe. But we could use an approach like that I think, okay, so we have 3 different funds with 3 different purposes. That might be a way to come up with your, that's not a rainy day fund. That's I forget what we call them. But anyway, that might be one of the reserves. And then maybe there's a stabilization reserve or something of that nature, which we then intentionally use in the coming few years, but with a clear eye to how that ends, so that we don't sort of sign up to endless, I'll use the word deficit, by which I mean expenditures greater than revenues annually in the general fund. That's just not a sustainable, but maybe it's temporarily something that we try to do so we don't so maybe we think about sort of pieces of funds, and instead of percentages, how much do we really think we need there? I would think would be a smarter way of doing this. So Don't know if we really have the capability, the staffing to do that, but I just want to throw those concepts out for us to think about.
If we do the initial analysis as a dollar figure, but you will need, the reason we kind of go percentages, we need an escalator.
Yeah, great.
And just figure out what the dollar figure is, then figure it as a percentage and maintain that percentage moving forward, assuming that revenues and expenses will somewhat reflect.
Yeah. I love that sort of approach. And if it, if you want to add a few other qualifiers in there, I think that's great too. Let's just be as smart as we can about it. But what I love about that approach is it's specific to our city. It's not what Oxnard, California needs. It's not what Issaquah needs. It's what we think we need. And we're not sort of setting aside money, because if you just look back at our fund balances out of the general fund, you look, well, how did you use those reserves? When did you use them? We haven't. They sit there. And it's not a small dollar amount. And as you pointed out on your slides, it's gotten to be a pretty big dollar amount. So I think we can sort of look at those. So in summary, I sort of think I just made 3 points. One is, I'm not sure we need 16% or 5%. I'd like if we have the bandwidth to do this. If we don't, then we don't, and we'll have to do something like percentages. But if we have the bandwidth to sort of think about what do we think our dollar amounts for our different reserves should be, roughly with escalators, yes. Number two, should we take some of that excess fund, put it into a stabilization type reserve with an eye to, hey, maybe we need to use that over these next 2 years or so that are, that we think this inflation shock is going to exist for. And then number three, I think, the notion of taking the excess fund balance and bleeding it out over time, I'm very opposed to, and I think that leads to very bad financial outcomes. But I think we have a terrible need over in our capital funds to fund all the things we're trying to do, especially with the fact that 8% inflation is going to hit all those costs. And so moving it over there to fund one-time costs, I think is what the policy's been and what I think we ought to do for whatever it's worth, one guy's view.
I guess I'm not uncomfortable with the existing reserve percentages we're talking about. I'm not sure I need to go do that analysis, but I think for your new one of, what were you calling it?
Stabilization.
Stabilization reserve, yeah, we probably ought to do the analysis. What's the appropriate dollar figure, and then back into what is the percentage of overall budget that would represent.
So let me see if I understand that. Could you go back? I think it's 1 or 2 slides. One more. No, one more. That guy. So if I'm going to try and follow what I think Councilmember Holloway just said. If I look at that first row, that's the fund balance required under our current reserve policy. Is that correct?
That's correct. It's a total of 16.5%.
Okay. And so Councilmember Holloway, if I understood you, I think you're saying, yeah, maybe we don't really, it's 2.8 million. Common sense tells you that's probably about the right, you don't necessarily feel the need to do any more work on that. Maybe that's just fine. We leave that. But then think about what do we do with that excess, that second row, and maybe stabilization reserve cover or fund, which we then use during this shock. Maybe that's something you support having a look at.
And then, like I said, back into a percentage. What's the dollar figure we think we need in there? What's the percentage of overall revenue? Because it'll be ongoing. And put that in there as stabilization fund as an ongoing item, a percentage of revenue.
Yeah.
Assume revenue, bad assumption, but you assume revenue goes with whatever cost escalations in effect.
So I think that sounds great. Although I would say this, whatever stabilization reserve we sort of decide, if we go this path, if we were to put one in now, my own view would be, let's plan to use it in 23, 24 to get us through this shock. This shock's going to be with us for a couple of years. Now we get out 3 years from now, if we're still in a shock, I got news for you. That's not shock. That's new normal. So we'll have to deal with that then. But so I would say whatever we put in there would be something we'd look to use over these next 2 years. And then to Councilmember Holloway's point of view, then future after that, we'd have to deal with, okay, now how do we sort of rebuild that so it'll be there when we need it next time? Did I get you right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I have a question. So you're thinking, so the stabilization fund is actually going to be a short-term fund that's going to help us out, like you said, in the next couple of years, besides the ARPA funds that we have in there?
That's what I'm
Right.
thinking. Now, if we don't need it, we don't need it, but that's my concept, yes.
Okay.
And the stabilization funds would go to the capital improvements that we were talking about?
No,
Is
the
that accurate?
remainder,
Oh,
my
the
thought is the
remainder
remainder
after that.
that wait, you moved off the slide.
So we'd be diverting the proportion that we'd be sending otherwise to capital improvement funds.
Yeah,
and
so-
setting it aside. So we'd have less in the capital improvement funds in the short term.
Right, so I sort of advanced this argument a little while ago that sort of at the end of 2022, that 3.5 million on the second row, I was advancing an argument, hey, send that over to capital funds. That was my first argument. And now I'm saying, okay, but maybe we use some of that for a stabilization fund and then send the remainder over to capital funds.
So how, and maybe I'm just not following that, how would that work then if we're siphoning off a portion to use for stabilization now, which is partly to address inflation? But then I guess, how would we use that little bit then that we're taking away from the capital improvement, which would also be suffering from inflation?
Yeah, wait, what was your question? How would we use it?
I'm just trying to follow. So if we have the $3.5 million and
Yep.
say we just take off $1 million to put it into the stabilization, right?
Okay,
And that $1 million is then going to be used to address the 8% inflation.
yes,
But then we're also going to be having over here with the remaining $2.5 million going towards the capital improvements. Those are also being subject to inflation. So I'm just trying to figure out then what we're doing exactly with that $1 million that we've siphoned off from what would otherwise be going to capital improvements.
yeah, so my thought was that million would then be built into the budget they would bring us for 23, 24.
Okay.
And so that for this combined biennium,
Mhm.
so if it was $1 million, say, then their expenditures they'd bring us would be $1 million higher than the projected revenues they would show us for the biennium. So that would then use up that $1 million to cover that shortfall by the end of the biennium. So it allows them to have expenditures higher than revenues because what we're trying to do is help them cover the 8% inflation, knowing that the revenue isn't going to go up 8%.
Okay.
And
So I guess
on
I'm,
the other side of the fence in capital,
Mhm.
you work them in priority order with the funding you have. If, based on the engineering estimates, we've got the plan. If the actual bids come in more, it's just, we're gonna move the line up and get a little less into the
Yeah.
capital projects.
But still, if we take, using that example, playing that out, if we take $2.5 million over to the capital funds, that helps a lot with that line not having to go up as far, right? Because it's more money into the pot, because if all those costs are going to be 8% higher,
Mhm.
the line would move to here. But because we're putting $2.5 million in, it doesn't have to go so far. There's still some projects that can stay in that otherwise would get cut. Does that make sense? So we're not,
Now,
but maybe the answer is we should send the whole 3.5 million over. It's just a question of where we try to help.
current CIP plan assumes $2.5 million coming from, it didn't necessarily state out of reserve, but $2.5 million is going over to CIP out of general fund.
Oh, I didn't realize that. Okay, so well, actually then, that example that Councilmember Christensen just gave would actually match up pretty well here.
Yeah.
Because the 2.5 would be what would be left after leaving $1 million in a stabilization fund in the general fund.
Oh, yeah. Does this chart already assume the 2.5 is shifted?
No, it doesn't.
Okay.
So that would be a nice dovetail then, perhaps, huh? But look, I'm not going to ask you to answer. You need to have time to think through what's sort of
appreciate
being
that.
advanced here. Yeah.
Well, I'll just say, in essence, you're asking for a risk-based analysis, right, of our reserve levels, basically. So in essence, if we've got infrastructure, we can look back historically But in essence, what maybe GFWA might propose is we think about maybe a worst case scenario. So for example, if the bridge goes out, how much would it cost us in order to make one bond payment, for example, in order to rebuild that bridge? And then we can figure out what that bond payment would be for a year, which would give us at least a year to figure out how we would then continue to pay for that bond or debt service over time. That might be a suggestion for something like that. For example, in terms of the stabilization reserve that you're suggesting, we can think about what is maybe the worst case scenario in terms of an inflation shock. Do we want to maybe start at 10% or is it 8%? What does that look like? And then we can kind of from there kind of work back, reverse engineer what that number would look like right overall for the city and then kind of operate from that. But
That's exactly what I was suggesting, only things, not worst case scenario. Because I'll tell you what worst case scenario, and it's a number that we could never afford. So I wouldn't say worst case scenario, but I would say maybe a sort of conservative approach, might be more of a way to say it. So look, if we think inflation's at 8, maybe we think about it more at 9 or 10, just to sort of,
and that's
that.
In my opinion, that's where council comes into play. So what kind of tolerance do you have for risk overall? Where do we want to set that line for? Is it 6% or 4% or 8%, for example?
So maybe what you could do is maybe think it through and say, look, guys, here's the deal. If you want to set it at 6%, it'd be this amount. If you want to set it at 9%, it would be, sort of give us a menu, but don't give us 20 items to pick from. We'll never be able to decide whether we want a hamburger or steak, but give us 3 items maybe, and we can probably manage that pick. There's one other thing you said that I wanted to say. So not worst case scenario. And then, the other thing I want to say is Councilmember Holloway, though, talked me out of pushing, we have to be mindful. You guys can only you don't have a staff of 100. So he kind of talked me out of, don't make you go back and look at the basic, what's on that first row. If that's coming from your 16% or 10% or whatever that is, he sort of talked me out of that, leave you alone on that. And I'm fine with that. So, only go into looking at, don't feel like you have a request to do that. If you want to look at it based on this discussion, go ahead, but otherwise you got a lot to do on your plate, so you don't need to do that. I withdrew that based on his comments.
I think our goal over the long term is structure the city appropriately financially. And so thinking about the funds and exactly how we may want to set them up could lead to us conducting that analysis more efficiently in the future, for example. So we have 3 reserve funds currently right now based on the current policy. It might make sense to consolidate those into 2
It might.
right at the moment and then kind of work our way from there.
Sure. I think politically, I'll just give you this political observation, and in particular by watching what happens at the state level, is if we have a reserve fund that's at 16%, which is what a lot of other cities use, okay? That is politically very easy to attack. If we have a $2.8 million fund, which we think is based on the kinds of disasters that our city has in fact experienced, plus an inflation factor, that is very easy to defend and very hard to attack. So for those that might not in the future understand why we need to have those fund balances, articulating it in that way, I think is a much more powerful argument and much more persuasive for people to say, oh yeah, I do need to leave that alone. For what it's worth. That's an opinion. It's not a fact. That's just my opinion. But look, we got to be careful not to overload you guys.
But if past councils had done what you just said, you wouldn't be having the ending fund balances you do now. So part of it is, as we cycle through council members, they get educated before they start to rate. They get educated of what are these fund balances and why do they exist.
Yeah.
Again, my concern with a flat dollar is it remains at that dollar figure, and then
No,
10
inflating
years
it.
from now,
Yeah.
where
No, look, they inflate it. Look, it's 2.8, then it's 2.9. I mean, they're doing exactly what you're suggesting. Yeah, I think that's great.
okay.
I mean, what we can build into the financial policies is the rationale for the need for that
Yes.
reserve.
Yeah,
And
which
so
is
this is
helpful.
an opportunity that Jen is presenting right overall to council for us to clean up quite a bit of that and state our case why we need these reserves. So
Just remember on those financial policies, any financial policy a council can make they can change. So when you put the rationale for it, then you've really given a future council something to think about. The less rationale there is, the easier for them to say, those guys were just, old fogies. Let's go. But you can only do what you can do. Time-wise, I mean, yeah. All right, you want to go back to your presentation, Sarah? I hope you were looking for some conversation and this was helpful.
Well, that's the best conversation, is for you to deliberate and to give us insight into what you're thinking. And when we look at the proposed policy, like Drew mentioned, is that what we'll bring back then is what we heard that you have an interest in, and like he said, maybe combining, because we have so many contingency funds, and in the proposed policy, it's about flexibility versus control. So if you have flexibility to have a contingency fund if you would like, however, if you can manage it in your general fund balance or other special revenue fund balances, then that's fine too, and it gives you that flexibility to do that. What we're hearing here tonight is the potential for us to put in that rationale, maybe adjust. The proposed policy suggests a range. So right now, the current reserves are at 16.5. The range was proposed at 15 to 20. So you have that capacity if you need to. For example, if a stabilization reserve fund is where the council ultimately goes, and let's just say it's at 3.5%, then we are at a total then in reserves of 20%. So that's, I think what we're hearing is that we can propose some modified policy statements in the proposed policy to reflect what you've had that conversation about tonight. And that's what we'll be doing then, because we appreciate the deliberations, and then we update what's been proposed, and that then gets us to the end goal of having updated financial policy.
Okay, is there anything else in your presentation? I know we kind of bounced around on you. Anything else that you want to go back and hit?
This information was specific to revenues, or excuse me, to reserves. And so there isn't anything more in this presentation. I do want to just make a comment about this financial forecast. These are things on our to-do list for, number one, updating the financial forecast. And then also, as we get into the budget deliberations, is that having a longer term forecast updated. We're updating all of the revenue sources. We're updating all of those expenditures. It's based on the departmental requests. It's based on what we're seeing. It'll reflect the inflation. It'll reflect increased costs. But then what we're hearing tonight was another comment about taking out the ARPA funds out of this and separating them.
Sequester those funds and do focus things with it.
Which might be general fund, like, for example,
Police cars.
well, that's not general fund, that's revolving fund, but it could be retention bonuses. Those would end up in general fund if we were to use it for something like that. But what you're saying is, rather than just bleed it into the general fund, have it specific things done with
We
it.
could use it for, I think some of the suggestions were like a economic opportunity pamphlet that we could send out to businesses and say,
Yeah.
hey, Snoqualmie,
Snoqualmie's
that'd
a
be a good
place.
time to send it to Amazon and whoever's down in Seattle and say, hey, we're much nicer out here.
And we,
Send it to 'em.
and we have trash cans
There
that
you
we
go,
empty.
trash cans, but we don't have the houses though.
Oh, yeah,
That's
there's
true.
that.
Well, we can work on that. I mean,
Wait a minute.
commuting into Seattle anyway, they probably chunk of them live out here in the burbs somewhere.
But so your point is, maybe have the ARPA money more have specific uses brought, as opposed to just lumping it into the whole.
New
Yeah.
uses brought for either retention is a good use for revenue or economic development, or something we could do that would reduce our expenses.
So the point is, he's not objecting to it eventually being spent in the general fund.
Yeah.
He just wants it having specific uses as opposed to just added to the top line.
Sure. So what we would do in this model here is that we would have a separate line item for ARPA-related spending.
Expenditures.
And then we could have supplemental details about what that is, so we could match. So right now, we've got proposed in 2022, $750,000. Well, then in an update of this, this model, we would then add in a line item that says
ARPA spending.
Yeah. And then that, so we could keep it in here, because if we pull out that, we pull out $2 million and put it off into a separate fund, which it is in Fund 150. But we keep it in here and specifically identify. So we hear you on.
And when you do that, I can just see, I can sort of do the math just in my head. You will then highlight the need for something like a stabilization fund, unless we're going to cut expenditures, because it will highlight, once you add that offsetting expenditure, your revenue over expenditures will flip. And so that'll show that need that kind of we were talking about.
We'll also be updating this, as Drew mentioned, the 2.5 million that was going to capital, and then also,
Oh, great.
Typically in forecasting models, we might have scenarios. So that's where the council gets to say, what do we look like under this scenario versus this scenario? And then, we start picking.
I just want to make one more comment off of this, if I just could, because I think it's really important for us.
Drew had his hand up when you get a chance.
Yep.
Okay, sorry, I'll get you to say. It's really important for us to understand, but even more importantly, it's really important for the full council to understand, in my view. I just want to draw your attention. Do you guys have it on your screen? I know those numbers are small. If you look over on the far right bottom, revenue under expenditures, 1,022,000. Okay, so if this were to happen as we see it on this chart and nothing else changed, that means we're $1 million short in 2031. And so if in 2030, and we almost have used up the ending fund balance, but just for sake of discussion, let's say that ending fund balance was then at 0. For the next year, 2032, you have two choices. Cut $1 million of expenditures, or somehow raise revenue. Well, tell you what, $1 million, if you want to raise it through property taxes, a 1% property tax increase right now is less than $100,000. So that is a 10% property tax increase, which, by the way, we can't do. We'd have to go to the voters and ask. And I can tell you, I'm pretty sure I know what they will think of that proposal. And so I think just that's where I made this comment of, no, that leads to terrible outcomes in the future. I think you just can't get to that sort of an imbalance, because you run out of fund balance and then, oh my God, what are you going to do then? So, asking voters for a 3% increase earlier is a whole different story than asking them for a 10% increase later. Mm-hmm. And it's not like this money's just sitting around. We have desperate need for it over in capital. So for what it's worth, I just want to, Mr. Boutte, I apologize.
Well, I was just going to add to the ARPA discussion a little bit. So we had a presentation at the last F&A committee where we kind of described this total ARPA pie, and 25% of that was going towards the community. Mm-hmm. For example, 50% was kind of allocated towards our financial forecast here. And then we had another 25% that was unallocated. Mm-hmm. And so the way that we kind of described it then is that the 50% that we've got built in here would likely go towards current programs, right, within the city. What I'm kind of hearing from council is actually, well, maybe that 50% should be built for or used for new programs. And so when you start using it for new programs, in essence, the line that Jen is proposing to add to the expenditures down below, you're going to see that number increase. And so that will then push the line up further to where it's even sooner, where we would have to address whatever kind of sustainability challenges that we have even more quickly than if we were to use that money on current programs.
Great comments. Got two things off of that. Let me, don't forget that if we do something like a sustainability fund, and then draw down it in those 2 years. That will help offset the concern that you just raised. So that's something to think about. The second thing is thinking about what Mr. Boutte just said, Councilmember Holloway. Are you open to some? So if we look at that line, ARPA transfers in was 750, so about 2 million in total. Are you open to some of that going to general fund, or would you like to see all of it specifically?
I already tried to rate it once. We just need to make a logical decision of how much is it for specific general fund things and how much is it for focus projects. And I would focus those projects on revenue or expenditures,
Right.
having some impact there.
So he's open to some proposal.
Mm-hmm.
This proposal in essence says use 100% of it just into the pot. He's not saying none of it into the pot, but he's saying maybe not 100% of it, and he's open to hearing from you. Is that a fair summary? And I would agree with that as well.
That's the right question.
No, we identified some principles at the last F&A committee. In essence, whatever we can do potentially with the unallocated funds in order to reduce our operating expenditures over time or increase our operating revenues over time, right, over the long term will help us with our sustainability issue that we are reporting here. So a lot of this is offsetting. So if we use the ARPA funds to support that, then our general fund revenues wouldn't be necessarily used for that, which hopefully we will be able to identify a lot of those items for you. But in essence, because it's an offset, it doesn't necessarily change too much the challenge that we're struggling with here for the most part.
Yeah, we get it.
So,
We get it. But I think the biggest thing is you look at all those things in this section called expenditures. I venture to guess not a single one of those has an 8% inflator attached to it.
no.
So the numbers are going to go real
It
ugly on you. Yeah.
It was based on the King County economic forecast from March of
As
this
it should
year.
have been. As it should have been.
And so I believe they're coming out with an update in August, for example, with additional new numbers, right? And then we would hope
And
to
it will
maybe-
be ugly.
we
It
would
will be
hope to
very
build,
ugly.
right, any sort of additional financial forecast based on those numbers from.
Yeah, okay.
And the other part of it is like, two easy things to say. Focused on revenue or expenditure reduction. Hard to figure out what to actually do. And I don't want the money waiting around while we try to figure that out. So I'm perfectly fine with some split of let's use it now and let's focus some on things we think we can actually do to have some revenue expenditure impact.
Okay, is that enough for this discussion then?
I think that
So,
is.
so what happens from here? What's the next thing? Do you guys think about this and come back to us at a future meeting, or like what happens next?
Well, we've got a fair number of sections to get through in financial policy. This is one section, and so if we want to continue to take this in pieces, then we would want to modify the F&A's committee agenda over the next several committee meetings in order for us to address expenditures and purchasing and investments and debt, which are probably some of the easier sections of it. But we'd want to do is bring back another update to this financial model. Now, granted, I've talked briefly about a longer term financial model, and you mentioned 10 years and what happens in year 11. And so, that's the intent long term. And I appreciate your thoughtfulness on our staffing capacity in order to do that. But we also, need that updated long-term forecast in order for the council to have those budget discussions. It's kind of that front piece that we need to start the conversation. So, so I think that we would want to continue the discussions at F&A to maybe we bring back an updated model, show some proposed revised policy around the reserve, and see if that's where we're hitting the mark, if so to speak, and then perhaps we can pick another section and start to review on that, because we need your
forward, yeah.
dialogue on and an understanding is if we're going in the right direction with the policy that's proposed.
Is that approach okay with committee?
Exactly what-
Mayor, is that okay with you, Mr. Sauerwein? Okay. All right. Please do that and go ahead and put that on our agenda and bring what you're able to as capacity allows, and we'll be there for you.
All right, thank you.
Just one more, I guess, if you can indulge me for a second. So I just want to talk a little bit about potentially overestimating our expenditures. What we do at the city here is we budget for our salaries and wages at the max, assuming that we have full staffing during that time period. And so that is what is driving quite a bit of our, underspending our expenditure estimates is because of that, especially during this 2-year COVID period. And so we may want to consider at least a policy. Do we want to budget at max staffing, or do we want to maybe incorporate some sort of vacancy rate right into our salary, wage, and benefit estimates moving forward? And so that is something I think overall that we need to kind of consider and help to reduce maybe some of that cushion that you might be thinking of. So
I don't know how other council members feel, but I strongly encourage you to do that. I'll tell you, in my professional life, all of our forecasts include, we call them attrition assumptions, which is basically you look at what your company's typical attrition rates are recently. And so let's say you have a turnover rate 15% a year. Then what you do is you sort of ballpark, well, how long does it usually take us to refill those positions, right? So like, oh, the chief's not here. I can't give him a hard time. I was just going to say how long it takes to replace police positions, but exactly. But you build in just you use your sort of historical attrition rate, which is pretty easy to get at. You just ballpark, don't worry if it's 13.8%, using 15% is fine. But historical attrition rate and historical rough estimate of replacement time periods. And from that, then you just take your budget and you reduce it by those assumptions. Look, there's assumptions all over your budget. So don't get worried about the fact that you're making some assumptions. Those are appropriate assumptions, because we're just not doing our residents any favors when we take their tax money and don't spend it on services for them. So I would strongly encourage you to do that. And I'll just tell you, we absolutely do that in my professional world in budgeting.
I think part of the struggle for us is we're a small city and we do have some small departments. And so there's generally a reluctancy, I think, to, if you have an 8 FTE department and you're assuming 1 FTE is going to attrition, well, what happens exactly if that happens, right? And then they're all of a sudden over budget because that attrition did not exactly take place during that year or that 2-year period, as maybe had been anticipated. I think part of our difficulty is might be a fear factor involved in having to come back to council and actually explain something like that. Overall, why is there this variance, right, that we're seeing? Why are you overspending your budget overall? And so I think that adds to the overall kind of equation, I think, to this picture. But
no, that's exactly right. So one of the techniques that I use in the professional life is to put that adjustment factor at what we would call it at the corp level. Put it at a like maybe put it in Mr. Sourwine's department or something like that, and then he can kind of then you've got it in your overall budget. You didn't sort of introduce all this pain at the departmental level where they're going to get frozen up by trying to make a decision like that. And by the way, you never know which department will be, right? But you put that in, and then that's something that your total budget is right, and then you kind of as you go through the biennium, the city administrator can say, right, that department had the shortfall, so I'm going to tell them I'm cutting back your budget for the remaining period because you're not going to spend that, so I'm going to take it from you, and that's how he covers the thing that he had in his budget. And so by the end of the year, you work out just fine. Does that make some sense? Or was that too complex? Okay. If you want to double back from me, I can show you how that's done. It's a straightforward idea.
Reserve.
Yeah, you have a negative. He has a negative budget, but he covers it over the biennium by snatching back from those departments where they had those vacancies. And so by the end of the biennium, he's fine.
I mean, there's legalities involved in how we appropriate these funds, and so a lot of this would have to take place in front of council if we do make those adjustments.
Of course.
Yeah.
But I think you're right on doing that, because the big concept, the big goal here has to be, let's stop underspending, right? ending the year in a government, ending the year with unspent revenues is not a victory. You'll hear people in government say, look, we ended in the black. And it's like, no, that's not good. Don't cheer. You under-provided services.
No, I think we would agree as the finance department, we do not like necessarily to collect excess cash, right, overall. Because if we're not going to use that money, it might be best spent or used in people's pockets as opposed to maybe the city itself. So
Oh, you're making the argument I was trying to avoid, which is, yeah, there'll be those who say, lower my taxes.
there is a
Yes.
balancing act, right, overall between what we need and, yeah, how much we actually collect. So.
Yeah. Mayor, go ahead.
So on the, can you pull up the financial statement? Because there's different buckets, right? And so we have it segregated into fire, and what are the different departments? So you have them all separate. So some might be over, you don't want them over, right? Because then if you spend more, then it actually takes 60% vote or a supermajority of council to move funds into that area. So it's not as simple as just saying he's over or he's under, right? Because I can't see it in the middle.
If you did it the way, Mayor, you're right on. And if you did it the way I was saying, what would happen is the departments would always end up under budget. And Mr. Sourwine would always end up over budget, but by offsetting amounts.
That doesn't show it. Okay.
Did that make sense? The departments would always end up under budget because when they have a vacancy, they have a budget for the full amount. The shortage is in Mr. Sourwine's budget. I don't literally mean his budget, but I mean a corporate, a central budget. But the central budget would end up with an offsetting overage because we gave him a negative spend line. So, you can kind of there's ways to work out and make sure you don't have any legal problems. But conceptually, that's how you do it, so that therefore the departments are still managing a budget. It's not like they get an idea, oh, I have to have a vacancy or I can't hit my budget. That's sort of not good thinking. So it might help to sort of math this out and sort of show you an example of how that could look. Maybe that would be helpful.
Well, and we should let them, you heard the ask, how you guys want to do it. I mean,
Yes.
in my world, we do a staffing plan and then 3 to 5% is taken off the top, assuming some attrition and some whatever from what that staffing plan would generate dollar wise. And that's it. So it's driven down to the department, to the group. But there are a number of ways of doing it.
Yeah, exactly. You can do it a whole number of ways.
The 10,000-foot view of what you're saying is account for the fact that it takes 6 months to fill a police department position, or it takes 3 months to fill a firefighter position, and build that into the staffing model.
And just sake of discussion, what if you ran out that math and discovered, oh, we have 26 police officers, but because of normal attrition, we could actually afford 27. Mm-hmm. That's a big thing to have another police officer, right? That's a big thing. So maybe I shouldn't have used police as the example there, but you get those kind of conclusions wherever it is across the organization.
Because as Drew said, I mean, most cities are going to budget total staffing at the top of the salary schedule. Overestimate your expenses, underestimate your revenue. That's how you stay out of trouble. And when a huge percentage of your budget is personnel costs, that's an easy way to do it. What you're asking for is a more sophisticated model.
Yep.
Mm-hmm. If I'm hearing what you're saying.
Yes, and the driver of that comment is, look at past years. We keep throwing off these excesses. We keep having unspent net money year after year after year, and it just builds up. And that's just lost chances to provide services. Sorry, Mayor, go ahead.
Well, so in the general fund, you have it split by administrative departments. In the Snoqualmie Police, fire and emergency management, parks, streets, and non-departmental. And so you can't just simply transfer between them unless we have to do an ordinance and get
We would have to come back
supermajority,
with a budget amendment.
right, in order to move it around. And so I guess we look at attrition has to be by each area instead of just
Right, you would
his
have a
area.
different attrition rate for police officers, for fire, for parks.
You're right, Mayor, that if you don't want to create that administrative sort of roadblock, then you would have to push it out. You're right.
Well, and that's what I meant by a more sophisticated model, because, as a practical matter, we don't want to be coming back to you every month and saying, okay, here's another budget amendment.
Yeah.
We want to be, but we could build into it, as you say, an attrition rate in each department. It's going to take, there's going to be a lot of guesswork in it. But it is certainly something that could get built into the model.
You're exactly right, Mr. Sarwine. I would say this, don't be scared of that kind of guesswork, because it's not flip a coin guesswork. That's actually those are pretty educated guesses. We can look at our attrition rates. Those can be pretty educated guesses, and there are educated guesses all over that thing, right? So don't be scared of educated guesses. I agree with you. If flip a coin guesses are not, we don't want to be in that business, but educated guesses, don't be scared of them is my encouragement. And bottom line is ending up year after year with unspent revenues is that we can, my goal would be to do better than that, provide more services with that or collect less taxes. It just screams opportunity to me to do, to give a better outcome to the residents.
Say, also, in consideration of operating expenditures, there is an opportunity if we do continue to collect right in excess of our expenditures to then transfer that to our capital program in order to support that overall as well. So
that's also true. It's interesting you brought that. I was almost going to say this earlier, but didn't want to say too many things, but you opened the door. You could think about what maybe our policy should say, something like what should happen to excess reserves, because you're going to end up with a policy, I think, that's going to say, let's say it's whatever you said before, 15 to 20% or something like that. But what happens when we end at 23%, which is the kind of outcome we have now? Policy silent. It says don't do that, but it doesn't really say. So if you want to, you could say, you can't say shall be transferred because that's up to the council. But what you could say as a policy matter is should be transferred, and then that would be guidance that says, hey, the next budget's going to come and propose shifting this. So something to think about.
So just as a quick on that, I think that the proposed one gives 3 options right now, including the one-time capital outlay expenditures, or to go meet emergency expenditures in case of flood, fire, and earthquake, and then temporary resources in case of an economic downturn, is what's proposed, at least in the new one.
Fantastic. So I think the concept, so you've already got the concept there.
Yeah.
What I'm saying is actually make that a little more specific and, say, it's for stabilization in the case of, revenue or expense shocks, that are expected to be 3 years or less, or, say, just put a sentence or two on there that just actually makes it much more clear that that's, because what you have there is, it's good, it's got the topic, but I'd encourage you to be more specific about it so that my perception has been since I've been on the council that there's a reluctance to go use those funds in anything other than just a clear emergency situation. The building fell down or the roof blew away, something like that. And I think certainly the stabilization concept that I'm talking about is a more, it's the roof didn't blow off, the water didn't stop coming from the river, but or too much of it came from the river and flood, but it's more of a, hey, here's a use case for it that we should use. Does that make sense? So it's sort of what you said, but with more specificity, I guess. Okay, we've beat you to death on this, haven't we? We leave it with you.
No worries. Like Councilmember Christensen identified in the proposed policy, we did provide for some specificity with regards to operating reductions. One-time uses is definitely highlighted. Capital asset investments and prepaying existing debt. But what we're hearing is that, to expand on those uses in this policy statement.
Well, my concept's a little bit different. I'm saying actually have a reserve called Stabilization Reserve and fund it with something saying this is how it's to be used. So rather than it sort of being an excess reserve, actually fund it as a specific reserve. Now, maybe some of the other reserves get pushed together, as you've said, but then maybe this one is one that we create specifically.
So that is what I've pulled up here is that this is that general reserve that we would expand and then add in another condition or revise these conditions for how it would be
Whatever
used.
makes sense.
Okay.
Yeah, have a look and whatever you think makes sense there. And Mayor, I just want to say, however you think is the best way to implement that notion of the attrition kind of concept, however you think's best, you guys know how you have to run things. Just let us know the best way to implement it. It's the concept that I was trying to get out, not the how-to. That's, you guys tell us.
Great. So I do have a question regarding financial policies. So to stay on track with the biennial budget, we were hoping to have approval by July 25th from council. So it doesn't seem like, that it'll probably take more than one more F&A meeting. And so I guess, can we set what the goal is going to be for this next meeting so we'd be prepared for it and have discussion regarding a section of, great if we only have like maybe 2 more F&A meetings regarding these at the most.
Completely agree, Mayor. Maybe I think we'll sort of do, if you could, staff or you could sort of assign us, please do these sections in the next meeting and these sections in the meeting following so that we're done. If you would just sort of assign that to us, I think we'll step up.
Mayor, I think that's appropriate. Definitely we'll be talking at the next F&A about reserves coming back, just to make sure that we've captured. I would like to propose that we talk about the expenditure section, because that entails, some policy with regards to purchasing and commitment authority, and that's always another hotter topic, if you will, in financial policy.
That's great. If you could ask Clerk Estrada or whoever prepares the agenda for us for the next meeting, if in the agenda, it just reminds us discussion of, so we'll have this item, which I think is like under an agenda bill, but if we could just have something that has a bullet or something that says discussion of expenditures and fund balance. So it just reminds us, be ready for those topics. That would be helpful.
Thank you.
All right, so we have used up a whole bunch of time. Let's go back to our agenda. Let me suggest this. See if this isn't acceptable, that's fine, just say so. But I would suggest that we provide, so we have an example financial performance report. If I could suggest that we talk about this at our next meeting, but ask that each one of us 3 send any comments we have directly to Ms. Ferguson so that she can consider them. And then the goal would be that at our next meeting, maybe we're ready to move through this more quickly, because in fact, we've provided any comments, and then particularly if there are questions or any thoughts, you'd then be in a position to kind of respond to those because you already knew that questions were coming, so to speak, or maybe you'd even answer them by email, however you prefer. But would that be, anyone object to putting that off then to our next meeting, that discussion? All right, if there's no discussion, we'll do, or no objection, we'll do that. And then so we need to, I've lost my agenda, hold on. This is the council agenda. There it is. So that was the discussion item. So let's move on to item 5, the draft city council meeting agenda. Roundtable, 6 p.m., the long anticipated mill site topic will come to us. What will happen at this roundtable? Will that be discussion or presentations, or I don't need a detailed answer, just generally curious.
Generally, it will be an introductory presentation about the decision from the hearing examiner, the state of the application, the record, what it looks like, what's in it, and then outlining a proposed schedule for upcoming council meetings for consideration, more detailed consideration of the application.
Fantastic. And would it be conceivable that there might be some questions council members would have that might be more appropriate in an executive session?
That's possible. We, I think, had a closed session on the regular agenda, potentially. It
Would
could
that-
be
would
moved
that-
into the roundtable as well if council were interested.
Well, perhaps we could notice it, that there may be, or, to include an executive session. We don't have to do one, but if we notice it, then if we do so, then at least we noticed it, yeah.
So notice it as part of the roundtable.
Yeah.
I'm thinking, just add, so it's not moving, not taking anything out of what's currently in the regular meeting, but just adding to the roundtable that there might be a
Possible closed session.
possible,
Sure.
yeah, whatever the correct terminology is, yeah.
Okay.
Okay, and then the regular meeting, got a presentation, potential closed session.
So
yes,
that one
ma'am.
we were thinking about deleting.
Oh, which one deleting?
That one, because that,
Closed session?
because we're
Oh,
not going to have we're not going to have a discussion about meal site during council. We're going to have it in the roundtable. So we'll just remove that.
got
And
it.
that'd be part of the roundtable.
Okay, so in fact, we would, by moving that thing to the roundtable, we don't need this anymore.
Right.
Got it. All right, some proclamations. Could we add, please, to the proclamation and appointments, an additional item, which is council, committee, and liaison appointments? And public comment, consent agenda. Is item 7, I think, is not actually coming forward, is that correct?
That's right.
Yeah.
That one's already been taken off.
That's it.
So then, based on tonight's discussion, is item 8 will also not come forward?
Right.
There we go.
This you have. Right.
No, I'd like also just, I think, as I'm thinking about how this will sort of play out, it occurs to me that, fellow committee members, I think we're having these in-depth conversations with administration and staff. I think it's going to be really incumbent on us to help explain to our fellow council members and argue for what ends up getting built into the budget based on these discussions, right? So I think we have a role to play in that. It's not just for staff and administration to then try and present those arguments. We're involved, we have to help with that when we get to budget time.
Number 8 is specifically focused on the council calendar, so.
Oh,
It's
is
not-
it?
not in
Oh,
depth.
I misunderstood.
Not the in-depth conversation we had tonight, just here are the dates for you to be mindful of.
Oh, that's all item 8 is? Just dates?
No,
What
I
else?
thought item 8 is exactly what we were just talking about tonight.
it is.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Right. We updated the budget calendar last meeting for the financial policies because they were moved. And so we probably want to update the budget calendar again for a little bit.
Check it out.
All right, and then CIP is item 9. All right, any other additions or changes for the council? Wait, did I miss a page? Yeah, any other items for the council agenda?
I just
Yes.
had a quick question. So for Parks and Public Works, there was a long discussion about the history of the pool. Is that gonna be brought back? Sorry, is that gonna be brought to council as well, any of that information that was provided in
Certainly
Public
can.
Works today? Because that might be helpful. I didn't do a count to see who was on, but it might be helpful so that everyone has that information fresh in their mind as they go forward with deliberations on the CIP.
Right.
Is this sort of a, I wasn't at the Parks and Public Works, sorry, but is this sort of like additional information about the potential project? Is that the sort of that nature or?
I think well, Nick, I'll let you speak to it. Sorry.
So, yeah, there's a document that Dana McCall put together that's in the Parks and Public Works packet, and it shows basically the history, how we even got to building the current community center, some failed bonds, and then so how we had the community center, and then it also has a cost comparison from 2019 to 2022, and what some additional adders are included in the costs so that it ties to the CIP, which is in the book.
Great, so that would be great. I'd very much appreciate seeing a presentation like that. Where would be appropriate place to put that? Would it be
Parks and Public Works.
Parks and Public Works? Would that, yeah? Okay, so it'll be it'll be a, I'm not quite sure what agenda those are anymore. It's a discussion.
Discussion agenda building
Okay.
for the new model we got.
So it'll
going.
be a discussion item under Parks and Public Works, and the discussion item is history of community center, something like that?
And some information about like the
costs.
past policy and basically the feedback we got from.
So,
public.
so some sort of
It's
title like
important.
that, right? You guys can fill in the details.
History and current scope.
History and current scope.
Assume scope. And
Hold on, I don't think they're listening. Let's wait for them.
Right.
I'm sorry, I'm not
So you
trying
said
to.
history.
So Mayor, the proposal is go ahead, Councilmember Holloway.
history, current scope, and proposed financing, actually, was the three things.
History,
Okay.
scope.
Are we having the debt conversation on here?
Yeah, there's a presentation on it early on, yeah.
Early on. And that'll roll into the conversation in the pool because it assumes a bond.
Okay, any other items then for the council agenda? All right, then if there's no objection, yes, Mayor, go ahead.
I think we will add an executive session to the end.
Oh, to the end of the regular meeting?
Right.
Okay. Then if there's no objection, then as amended, the council agenda will take that as approved. Seeing no objection, that is approved. Bless you. All right, let's see that. Oh, finance and, is there, I couldn't quite figure this out. So we've got a finance and administration work plan update that was attached. Is there any action needed by us, or that's just informational item? It just sort of, I think, updates us on what the coming work plan is. So she's, Clerk Estrada's been doing that each meeting, which is fantastic. Gives
Right.
us kind of line of sight.
Or if there's anything else that you wanted to add to it. So,
Nothing, council members, anything you want to add to it? Nope, I think we're good. All right, if there's no other business, then we'll adjourn the meeting. See no other business. If there's no objection, we'll stand adjourned. See no objection, we're adjourned. Thank you, everyone.
thank you.